Welcome to the show. We have a pretty simple, straightforward project we're going to be doing today. I'm starting with this piece of diamond plate or tread plate. This is a scrap of steel that I picked up from a local scrapyard. It was in a whole armload of stuff that I got for about 10 bucks. And I figured it was just about right for a project that I've been wanting to do for a while. Now for this project, I'm going to use only an angle grinder. I've done a project like this before, and that has actually become one of my favorite videos. So I will link to that one. At least I'll have a link to it at the end, if not right up here right now. The idea behind this is, knife making, of course, can be a very involved and complicated process, and it can take anywhere from a couple of hours to make a knife up to, there are people who spend weeks crafting a knife or a sword. But if you really think about what a knife is, it's a tool. It can be much more than that. It can be a family heirloom. It can be a trusted companion. It can be part of a set of knives that may exist for a certain purpose, like food preparation, or could be part of a survival kit, or something that you throw in a toolbox. There are all sorts of different purposes for knives, but ultimately a knife is just a tool. And sometimes I really like to step back and remind myself of that and do a project or two where I'm just sort of having fun, creating something that has some utility to it, something that has maybe a certain aesthetic that I find pleasing, but may not necessarily be resellable or whatever, but just a fun, simple, interesting knife that maybe has a certain amount of specific practical utility, but it might also not fit with sort of the standard definition of a handmade knife. I'm using a piece of steel that probably is a low carbon steel, so I'm not even going to bother trying to harden, heat treat and temper this blade. I'm going to treat this much more like just an expedient project. You have limited access to tools, limited access to metals. You just need a knife that can do some big chopping tasks, might act in a self-defensive role or in a survival role, but again, probably fairly limited because it won't be heat treated. So it's not going to be the type of knife that you can really put a fine edge on and then expect that edge to last. But I will be demonstrating that it can still be a very useful knife, and depending on the edge geometry, and I'll kind of get into that in a minute here when I'm putting the edge on the knife, you can actually get a lot of use out of a mild steel edge that has not been heat treated. If you're going to do a project like this and you want to have a useful blade when you're done, I would start with a minimum thickness of at least 1/8 inch. I think this piece is probably closer to 1/4 inch. It may not be quite that thick. I didn't put calipers on it. But certainly if you got into the range of 3/16, or again, really anything over about 1/8 inch, you can make a knife from unhardened steel that will definitely have some utility to it. As you probably noticed when I sketched this out, I was really just doing a rough sketch with some soapstone. I had drawn it out before, but I didn't have the drawing with me, so I just kind of worked from memory. And the design that I'm going for, it's a little bit over the top. I kind of debated calling it the angry Rhino, or because it's just got this really mean look to it, and it's got this big almost rhino horn thing in the front. And of course the fact that I'm making it out of tread plate gives it this really rugged post-apocalyptic look. And that's a big part of what I was going for here, because again, if all you need is a big knife for a certain purpose, and you're in a situation, maybe a survival situation, limited access to tools, but you still need to be able to make a good, reliable blade that will do the job you need it to do, you can do that with very limited tools. I'll be using a grinder, as I mentioned. This one happens to be a Black & Decker grinder that I got off of Amazon. I imagine some eyebrows went up out there when I said that. But listen, since I got my Amazon affiliate account, I have occasionally referenced different tools that I'm using and invited people to go ahead and follow my links if they're interested in buying them from Amazon. And most of the time I go with very highly rated stuff, or stuff that I've tried myself, so I know that it's good quality. But the one that keeps coming up every time I search Amazon, it's this Black & Decker 6-amp angle grinder. And it's really inexpensive. It's so inexpensive that for me, I've always been tempted to order one myself, but I haven't yet. But I keep thinking, if I'm offering this to other people as a potential, I should definitely get one and put it through its paces and maybe even do a review on it. So consider this to be kind of a preliminary review of the angle grinder that I got off of Amazon, and I will have a link to that here. Usually when I do a video like this, I will have in the description below, even if I don't mention it, there'll probably be a couple of Amazon affiliate links that I include. But back to the project, as you can see, what I've been doing here is just following those lines, not right up to the line, but getting close to the line, cutting out the shapes, and leaving myself a little bit of extra because I'm going to come in with the actual grinding disc afterward and really clean up those edges and get a sense of the shape of the knife, whether it's really taking on the shape that I want it to have. And I'm giving myself a little bit of leeway so I can trim it here and there later and really craft the look that I'm going for. Some of these tasks are pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to comment on everything that you see me doing. But if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them below. Also, I have several other videos that are, I would call them beginner type videos, or videos where I'm doing pretty basic type of stuff. With that said, you could probably look at pretty much all of my videos as beginner type videos because I've really only been doing this for about a year. But again, there are some techniques that are pretty common that I see a lot of people doing. For example, if you're cutting with a grinder and you're trying to get into a tight space, you can see that you can't turn once you get in there. There are other tools that you have a certain amount of leeway with, but with a grinder, you can really only cut in straight lines. So you'll see me sort of cutting in and creating these little tabs. Sometimes we call those relief cuts, and that lets you come in at a little bit of a different angle and cut out some pieces until you can kind of get in there and clean them up. And of course there'll be some jagged edges and stuff. Then you get out the grinding disc and then you go and clean up all the rest of that stuff. I don't know if I made it clear at the beginning, but this is not a process I would use when I was crafting every knife. I have done it before, used nothing but an angle grinder to make a knife just to demonstrate that it could be done and to demonstrate how much utility there is in a grinder. But of course there are different tools for different jobs. And if you want to become, for example, if you want to become a professional knife maker, if you want to make knives that you're going to sell to others or give as gifts, you're probably going to need more tools than what you'll see me using on this particular build. For me, this is letting my artistic side out and seeing where it takes me. Will this here ever translate into work on a professional knife that I'm making for a client? It actually could. People that go to like comic conventions and things like that, those people often are looking for elaborate or unusual gear that will fit with a certain costume that they're using. And they don't necessarily want a heat-treated blade that, will last 100 years, but they're looking for something that'll give them kind of an edge in terms of the authenticity of their outfit. I think this type of knife could go a long way in that kind of a role because it does have a very rough, rugged, apocalyptic, grungy kind of a look to it. Definitely looks like something that would be improvised after, the zombie virus breaks out or whatever. So it does have that aspect to it. But for me, whether I ever found a buyer for this or not isn't really relevant because I'm making this for me. It's something I've wanted to do to explore some much more wild geometry than what I've been doing on a typical knife, and just really let my imagination go a little bit crazy. So anyway, I've had a lot of fun with it. I will say though that I'm not just throwing caution to the wind and running the grinder all over this thing. I am doing my best to observe proper craft while I do this. A good example of that is as I'm putting the edge on this, I'm using the grinder in the way that I would use a set of files or I would use maybe a belt grinder. I'm trying to keep it at one consistent angle with regard to the edge of the blade. Now, because this will be a mild steel and it's not going to be a hardened steel, I am doing a little bit of a convex grind just to add a little bit of strength. And you'll definitely see when I get it done and I kind of hold up the blade and you can see the angle of the actual knife edge, that this is a fairly consistent edge that I'm getting here. As I was getting close to finishing up the grinding work and putting the edge on, I was looking at kind of the overall appearance of the knife. I had thought about getting out the flap sanding discs, and I will actually use them a little bit on the edge, but I thought about going over the whole knife with the flap sanding disc and getting it so that it had that nice brushed steel finish to it. But this piece of steel, it sat around a scrapyard for a while, and then I picked it up and it's been sitting in a bin, and it just has this fantastic patina to it. It's not overly rusty, but it's just a good blend of different darker, grungier colors and then a little bit of lighter rust around the edges and stuff. And I don't know, I really liked it. So I decided not to mess around with that finish at all. But I will make a recommendation. If you are doing a project similar to this and you want to try something different, when you're done, if you heat up the steel to about, maybe 250, 300 degrees, and either use like a beeswax or even vegetable oil or some other type of oil, and apply that wax or oil to the hot steel, keeping the steel below the temperature at which the wax or oil will actually burst into flame. Then when you apply the wax to the steel, you'll get this, it'll smoke a little bit and maybe sizzle a little bit, but you'll get this really, really dark black finish. And actually blacksmiths have used that for thousands of years to put a protective coat and also nice looking finish on steel. So that would be something to try. But again, for me, I just really liked the overall look. There's just the right amount of grunge without looking like total junk. One or two of the techniques here I should comment on. This grinder is much lighter weight than the other one I had. And also being a 6 amp grinder, I'm not sure what the RPMs are on it, but I wasn't sure exactly what I would think of that, you know, like is this gonna be an adequate grinder? But it's actually done everything I asked it to do. And actually, because it's lightweight, I feel much more comfortable holding it in one hand and while I hold the workpiece in the other. Now, I'm pretty much 100% sure that no factory safety instructor is ever gonna tell you to use a grinder like this. I'm doing this because it made sense to me to do it. I am not recommending that you do it. Always observe proper safety precautions. Safety has to come first when you're working with tools like this. A grinder can do a lot of damage. I've been snagged a few times. I've been hurt a few times. Fortunately, it's been nothing severe and I've learned my lesson each time. You know, you learn a little more each time. But I've got a couple of scars. So always be as careful as you can when you're working with tools that can potentially do a lot of damage. So to finish up, the very last little bit of the edge, I didn't want to leave that up to the grinder, so I got out some sandpaper and kind of improvised a sanding block, and I'm using that to just put the final finishing touches on the edge. Keeping in mind that this is a rough edge. This is not the kind of thing you're going to take out and slit paper with. Although if I took the time, I probably could put that kind of an edge on there. But that really wouldn't be practical, because if you have a really, really fine edge on a piece of steel that isn't hardened, you know, if you're just slicing meat, it'll go dull, but you know, it's not going to ruin the edge. You just have to sharpen it again. But with this, I want to be able to chop wood specifically. That's a part of what I created this for. And if you hit a hard block of wood with an unhardened piece of steel and you have a fine edge on that, you will just immediately damage the edge, like first swing. And I know this because I've tried it before, and you're going to spend the next half hour trying to clean up your edge. So I didn't put that real fine edge on it. You know, the full thickness of the blade comes down within probably a ½ an inch back from the edge, and then I kind of round it down to the edge with a convex grind. So that puts a lot of thickness of steel right behind the edge. So it's something that'll split wood well. You'll see me here, I'll test it in a minute, and I'll be you know, chopping through wood, like through small branches and stuff. And it works great in that roll, but this is definitely not the real fine work kind of knife. The one thought that's kind of been in the back of my head the whole time, the curvature of this blade, you've got all this wonderful belly, looks like it would be a great skinning knife. If it was actually hardened steel, I think it would be great for skinning. But from my experience, you can actually ruin a knife pretty quick skinning out a large deer. So I would think that a knife like this, where you don't even have hardened steel, as a utility, general survival, does everything kind of blade, probably isn't the best. It's better than nothing, for sure, but there are clearly much better designed knives for that purpose. Now, to put the grip on, I did mention in the last video I did, I might do a cord wrap or a twine wrap, and then use fiberglass resin to demonstrate that. I sort of tried to in the last project, and I kind of screwed it up because I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. But anyway, I might use this knife for that purpose. If I do, it'll be another video, because I think it would look pretty cool with that wrap. But in this case, I just used hockey tape, which I've done before, and I have to say, of the materials that you can use, hockey tape is one of the most versatile. It's one of the least expensive. It's a certain amount of weatherproof. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, go leave it at the bottom of the lake, but you know, for any ordinary use that you're putting a working knife through, there's nothing wrong with hockey tape. It might be ugly, and I'm not going to argue with that, but I mean, just look at this knife. This knife is just begging for some kind of an ugly, you know, improvised, grungy handle. I mean, just look at it, you know? So to me, it was kind of the perfect complement to the overall aesthetic that I was going for. So unfortunately, I went out to split some wood with this, and I didn't find any good, you know, I like to have good short pieces, you know, maybe 14 to 16 inches. I could find all these pieces that were like 2 feet long, and or were shorter, but had all these knots and funny things sticking out the side of them. So I hadn't really prepared the right wood for demonstrating the splitting ability of this. But you'll see me putting it through a few different tasks here and struggling a little because, again, the wood that I have here, I mean, this is the kind of thing I would use like a splitting maul. But I think you can see, you know, enough of what I'm doing here that in the right role, I think this would serve pretty well as a wood chopping knife. Now at the end here, I'll show you the edge. It might be a little hard to see. I don't think the lighting is real great, but there really isn't any damage. Even when you get in really close, a lot of times what I've seen with unhardened steel is if the edge gets too thin, it'll actually roll. It'll bend over and you get kind of a little roll of steel. You can't just sharpen it up again. It's like you have to, you know, pretty much have to grind it down in that spot and rework it. So that's part of the reason why I went with that convex edge. Of course, it's gotten dull because it is soft steel and I've been whacking on wood with it. So I grabbed a little scrap of cardboard here and did a little bit of cutting on it so you could see that it does still have a cutting edge. Again, this isn't a sharp edge, but it held up pretty well to the chopping. And considering that this is, again, a mild steel, I would say it did about as well as you could expect from a piece of steel like this. Well, thanks so much for watching. I hope you had fun. You know, for those of you who might be sitting on the fence thinking about getting into knife making, not really sure if you have the skills or you have the tools that you need to do it, you know, there are so many different ways to make a knife. There is not a wrong way to make a knife. Just get a hold of some steel, some basic tools, you know, just make something you want to make. Do the best you can. Maybe you'll hate the first one you made. Maybe you'll love the first one you made, but keep working at it. It's not hard to get into. You probably walk out to your garage right now, find an old piece of steel, get a metal file or a grinder if you've got one, get to work, and you know, an hour or two later, you could have a knife like this one, or you know, your own design. So thanks again for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I will have a couple videos linked at the end that will kind of be in a similar vein to this one. Oh, and check the description below. I'll have a link to the grinder and also to the face mask, the respirator that I use, so you can look at those links. And I guess with that, I will sign off. So have a wonderful day. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you in the next video.
Always wear one of these.